So, what we're going to cover during asynchronous today is a type of associative learning called classical conditioning. I want us to cover it right now, relatively quickly, so that next class we can do a lot of practice with this, because this is something in this class that does need practice. It's not particularly challenging, but you just need to practice with it to be able to identify the different parts of it. Classical conditioning is a type of learning that, according to behaviorists, happens automatically, which means that there is not any conscious effort that goes into it. What it is a linking of two previously unrelated stimuli. Okay, the linking of a stimuli that was not related before, what is called neutral, right, with a stimuli that causes an involuntary or unconditioned, unlearned response, such as, something like that is when you get a puff of air in your eye and you automatically blink. That's an unlearned response. Okay. If I were to blink a light and then put a puff of air in your eye and then you blink, eventually you might learn that that light predicts that you're about to get a puff of air in your eye. And so that light could, in theory, make you blink. What classical conditioning allows us to do is anticipate what will come next based off the linking of if A happens, then B happens. Okay, could say it is a type of top-down processing. Okay, it's a type of top-down processing, and it allows for correlation. So, for instance, this example right here, you're listening to the song Mo Bamba, and then your significant other comes in, breaks up with you, with this while that song is still on. All right, you may now in the future link that song with being broken up with, and so in theory, in the future, that song could make you feel sad. Right? That is classical conditioning at its core. Now, classical conditioning was discovered by a Russian by the name of Ivan Pavlov in the mid 1800s. Pavlov was a gastroentomologist who was measuring the salivation in dogs. And what he was doing is he was feeding them and then measuring how much they salivated. What he did by accident was he started to ring a bell before giving the dog food. And so he rang a bell, gave the dog food, and then the dog salivated. Eventually, though, the dog started to salivate at the sound of the bell. What he hypothesized was that the dog had linked the sound of the bell to getting food, and so the bell let the dog anticipate food, and so the dog would have that involuntary response to the sound of the bell. Okay, he called this classical conditioning. And it just happened automatically. The dog didn't sit there and think about it. It just, after repeated pairings of the bell and food, all right, the dog just linked the two. So what I'm going to use as to go over classical conditioning is Pavlov's experiment. Probably the hardest part of this unit is the terminology of it, but I think for the most part, a lot of you all already know about Pavlov's experiment. All right? So for classical conditioning to occur, we have to start off with what is called something that is unconditioned or unlearned. It says unconditional, it should be unconditioned. What we have is what is called an unconditioned stimulus, which is something that naturally causes, without any learning, a response. What is called an unconditioned response. Just so we know, unconditioned means unlearned. Okay. Now, for classical conditioning to occur, we have to bring in something that is unrelated to either of these two. In this case, in Pavlov's case, it was a bell and a metronome. This is what is called a neutral stimulus. Without any learning, when you ring a bell for a dog, the dog is not going to salivate. But when you give a dog food, it will salivate. You can see automatically happens, unconditioned, all right, but there is no response here to the bell. So for classical conditioning to occur, that is what we have to start off with. So what we do is we have to learn that this neutral stimulus predicts this. Why it's doing all this. So for learning to occur, the process of learning this association is called acquisition. Right? Acquisition is the process of learning to make the association between the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. So in Pavlov's experiment, he would ring a bell and then he would put food through on this little tray to the dog, and then that food would naturally cause the dog to salivate. So you have to do this for repeated pairings usually, because we have to learn that this anticipates this. And it's rare that that association would happen on the first time. So the acquisition period is learning to link the neutral stimulus to the unconditioned stimulus. And then the unconditioned stimulus causes the unconditioned response. Once learning has occurred, we know that learning has occurred when you ring the bell and all of a sudden the dog salivates without any food. Because the dog has learned that the bell right here predicts the food. So you ring the bell and the dog salivates without any food. Okay? When this occurs, this is what we know as conditioning. When this occurs, the neutral stimulus, the bell, or what was previously the neutral stimulus, because what becomes what is called the conditioned stimulus or the learned stimulus. And the unconditioned response, the thing that naturally happened before to food, but now happens to the bell, is what is called the conditioned response. All right, it is a learned response to the sound of the bell. All right, so you can see basically, if you want to make this into kind of a math problem, once you figure out what the neutral stimulus is, the unconditioned stimulus, and the unconditioned response, you can kind of just go in and take out that unconditioned stimulus, and you've figured out what all the different pieces of this are. So, neutral stimulus is the bell. It's presented before the food. The food causes salivation. We do this multiple times. Okay, and then eventually the bell, which predicts food, and the dog starts to salivate at the sound of the bell. Once that happens, we know that learning has occurred. There's a video here if you want to see, if you want to watch this process. So next class, we're going to do practice with this. All right, so if you're confused right now, you will hopefully be able to get it squared away by next class. Okay? All right. Thanks, guys.